I'm working on shawl collared sweaters at the moment. The written version of what I'll show you today is a new chapter in the Answer Ladies machine knitting notebooks. The notebooks exist in 2 gauge sets, one for standard and bulky, and one that has 2 mid-gauge gauges. Both notebooks are receiving the upgrade, so if you already own the book, you will be getting a notice that you have a new file to download. If you buy the book, this will be included. There's also a version of this material going to Country Knitting of Maine News and Views Machine Knitting Magazine. And today I'd like to go over with you the very simplest version, the basic shawl collar made with stockinette. The one you're looking at is on a half-size model. She's exactly proportioned, like half the size of a woman with a 36-inch bust. So she has an 18-inch bust. This is an actual pattern I'm designing, and it will appear first in Country Knitting of Maine News and Views. You could, however, if you had all the information you need, put a collar like this on any basic sweater, such as any of the ones in the Answer Ladies knitting notebooks, standard, bulky, or mid-gauge. A sweater with a plain front, such as this one, could have this treatment applied just by using math. I'll show you how to do that at the end of the movie. And by the way, you're looking at a drop-shouldered sweater, but modified drop shoulders or shaped shoulders with set-in sleeves will also work. As you join me, I have finished the sweater front up through the armhole shaping and knitted to what will be the bottom of the neckline. We're at this point in the knitting, and at this point, we need to bind off the center front stitches in whatever number is appropriate. The appropriate number is creating the width of the beginning of the bottom of the neckline. So if you wanted an 8-inch opening and you're getting 8 stitches per inch, you would bind off 64 stitches. I'm binding off 24. Let's get that done. Since I'm binding off around the gate pegs, although you may use any method that's neat that you like, I'll need to then lift those stitches off of the gate pegs that are holding them, get the yarn tails out of the way, and place the needles on the side away from the carriage and hold, because from this point we will work the neckline in halves. Remember to set the carriage so that it will hold those needles that are all the way forward. Knit the required number of rows to the shoulder, and then bind off. A quick note here, the neckline for this particular design is square. Sometimes they're a V with a flat bottom, so that would mean there would be decreases on the neck edge if that were the case. Also, in this particular design, the underarm shaping for the armhole is complete by the time I start the neckline, but sometimes it is not, and you have to do a little bit of decreasing on the sleeves edge, the armhole side, at the same time as knitting the rows that we just knitted. But we're up to the shoulder now, and it's time to bind off. If you've been working with significant weight on the knitting, you'll probably want to reduce it now or even remove it altogether, because now we have only a small number of stitches, and that might be too much weight for them and it might distort them. Set the carriage to knit back from hold and repeat the same number of rows, including, if they exist, any decreases. We want to make the second side match the first side, of course, so it should be the same number of rows. What you see me doing just then is weaving in the yarn tail as I knit. Of course, we had to break the yarn to finish the bind off on the other side and start anew, and I wanted to get rid of my yarn tail as fast as possible. So now this side is done, and we can bind it off. And here's the shape we have. A big, deep square, which we will fill in with the shawl collar that we'll knit next. Next, we need to sew the front to the back at one shoulder seam. You may use any method you like. Here I've got the 2 aligned on the machine, so I can use the gate pegs to space the stitches and act as though I was binding off to create a seam. Sometimes the collar is knitted separately and then sewn into this position, but for this design, we'll knit it right onto this area, extending all the way around to the center back with one half of the collar, and then do that with the other half also, and then seam them at the center back. So we're hanging the neck edge from the bottom of the flat spot, but we're not hanging the flat spot all the way up the side of the neck, and then we're also hanging the back neck edge. Generally, you ease a little tiny bit going up the side of the front, and you do not ease across the back because there you can hang stitch for stitch. Generally, however, the pattern will tell you a stitch count you're aiming for. Now, depending on which side of the neckline was hung, we'll knit either the left or the right half of the collar. After knitting that first row, it's important to check and make sure that you actually got each needle in an individual opening in the knitting, otherwise you'll get runs. I was good to go on this one, so now I can knit the next rows of the collar. The collar rows are going to seem like a lot because we're knitting a double stockinette collar, and that makes a very warm sweater and doesn't require anything fancy of your knitting machine or of you, but it does require a lot of rows to make the doubled fabric. Having knitted all of the rows, you could hang the same area that you hung to begin with and bind off, and that would seam the collar inside to the outside seam in one single step, and you would be done. However, in this case, I prefer to bind off separately because I think I can make the seam just a little bit flatter and neater if I do that. It's a judgment call per garment, and you may have a personal taste, and that's totally fine. The second half is knitted exactly as the first half was, with one slight difference. If the back neck stitches were on the right side of the work last time, they'll be on the left side this time. Sew the collar pieces together at the center back seam. And now, if you did not hang and seam the collar in a single step, as I mentioned you could do before, is when you close the seam the way I'm doing. And what I'm doing is trying to catch only one strand of yarn from each position and whip stitching closed in such a way that the outer edge of the top layer of collar covers the inside neck seam to make it a little bit flatter and a little bit more comfortable around the neck than I think the other method would be. I'm also not whip stitching through every single stitch. In many cases, every second or third one will be okay. And we do this all the way around the interior edge of where the collar meets the neckline. While we were knitting the collar, of course, there was a left and right edge. Two of those edges are already sewn together at the center back, and now we sew the remaining edges both to the center front. What I'm doing now is an optional step, but I like to baste the center front lower edge and pull it in so it perfectly aligns with the collar. It will have been mathematically designed to do so, but it may have stretched while it was on the machine, and it's just easier to get your knitting aligned with the basting step, but it is optional. Both of the remaining edges will get sewn to the same spot, and so the collar will overlap at the center front. This makes it very, very warm. Any seam that works for you may be used, but I like to do the layers separately because I think it's easier to get a neat job done where the outside looks nice. I find it easier to do neatly by first sewing the two layers of collar together and then sewing the two layers of collar to the neck edge and then repeating that for the interior layer. I do the outside layer first, but it could go either way. So here are my collar layers being sewn together. Here I'm working across, making tiny stitches, and here I do work into every stitch, and a pointier needle would have been more fun, but this is the one at hand. Any neat method may be used, but this area is very much on display, so I like to be really careful, make tiny stitches, and check as I go to make sure everything is aligning evenly and the stitches don't show. Now I can go to the inside and sew the interior layer to the lower edge of the neckline too, and then the neckline will be complete. Now let's design our own neckline using very easy make-believe numbers. These would be realistic for a man's sweater or an oversized lady's sweater. Let's say we want a 10-inch width across the bottom of the neck and a 10-inch drop from shoulder seam to bottom of the neck. So we'll get a nice big shawl collar. And our stitch gauge and row count is 4 stitches, 6 rows per inch, a very common bulky gauge. First, we need to find the row at which to bind off the center stitches by multiplying the 10-inch depth we want by the 6 rows per inch. That's 60. So we subtract 60 from the total row count. If our total row count was 200 and we subtracted 60, we would get 140. So that's when we need to bind off the center front stitches. Now, how many should we bind off? We'd multiply the desired width of 10 times the stitch gauge of 4 per inch, and we would get 40 stitches to bind. So when knitting the sweater front, we would knit to row 140, bind off 40 center stitches, then knit 60 rows up one side and 60 rows up the other side to the shoulder. Now to size the collar, we use the neck depth of 10 times the stitch gauge of 4, and that means 40 stitches run up along each side front of the collar area. In addition to that, each half of the collar includes half of the stitches across the back neck. Half of the back neck stitches is 20, so we add that to the 40 stitches that will run up the side neck, and there are 60 stitches for each half of the collar. To get the row count for the collar, we use the row gauge times the width across the back neckline. 6 rows per inch times 10 inches is 60 rows, but that's only one layer, and we need 2, so we multiply that times 2 to get the 2 layers, and we need a total row count of 120. You may wish to refine these numbers just a hair to allow for the cast on and bind off or a seaming stitch, but just as they are, they will work fine.